Hello, and welcome back to Calgarian Born Chinese, the docuseries dedicated to exploring the ins and outs of what it means to be a second-generation Chinese Calgarian. My name is CJ, and over the past few episodes, we've looked at everything from Chinatowns to the Cantonese language, but if you'll humor me for a moment, I'd like to take an opportunity this episode to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm really excited about it because it offers, in my perspective, a different way to engage with the Chinese culture here in Calgary in a way that might be a little less daunting than some of the more formalized cultural approaches that we talked about earlier. And yeah, I'm just really excited about it because I just have a soft spot in my heart for games more broadly. And spoiler alert, we're going to be talking about two games within the Chinese diaspora community here in Calgary, Mahjong and Chinese chess. Now, both of these games actually have pretty dedicated and active communities here in Calgary, which is really heartening to hear about. Before I get too ahead of myself, I'd like to take an opportunity here to sit down, break out the board games, and sort of just give you a brief overview on how these games are played so that if you have the opportunity to, you can engage with the community and sit across the chessboard or around the table playing Mahjong, because these games are interesting and fun to play online and on your own, but it's another thing entirely when you can be with your loved ones and with community and experience it that way. I think there's no real replacement for that experience. But without any further ado, let's dive into it. I'm excited to be welcoming you to the wild, wacky, wonderful, oftentimes weird world of Chinese board games. So in front of me here is a classic chessboard, and I'm not going to belabor the point by going into painstaking detail about all of the rules of the game. I'm going to assume you have some prerequisite knowledge here. But long story short, each player has 16 pieces set up on their end of the board, and chess is a turn-based strategy game. So each turn, players alternate coordinating their pieces in order to attack, defend, and ultimately win, either by checkmating the opposing player's king or forcing them to resign. But something that fewer of you might be aware of or knowledgeable about is the history of chess and its variants. So, as it turns out, Western chess is one variant of the ancient Indian game Chaturanga, which dates back to the 6th century and is abstracted on the following board. So, it's pretty similar to chess on a purely visual level here, based on the abstraction on this website, but there's a couple of key differences you've also probably noticed. So first off, let's start with the king, which is known as the Raja in Chaturanga, and it moves and captures the same way that a king does in Western chess, which is one square in any direction. Next to him, though, we have our first different piece, and this is known as the Mantri, meaning minister or counselor. And unlike the queen in Western chess, the Mantri is relatively weak. It can only move and capture one square diagonally in any direction, so it lacks the movement and the attacking/defending potential that a queen does, but that is the Mantri's burden to bear. Flanking the king and Mantri are two Gaja, or elephants, which is a mix of a bishop and a knight in chess. And I acknowledge that description is incredibly anachronistic to say, but I don't really know how else to describe it, because the Gaja moves diagonally, like a bishop, but only in two-spaced jumps. So, for example, the elephant on the f1 square can move to the h3 square as the white player's first move, which jumps over the g2 pawn like a knight. However, the elephant can only move 2 squares at a time, so the same f1 elephant cannot ever occupy the e2 or g2 squares. Thankfully, once we move past the Gaja, we've got the Ashva, which is the horse, and the Ratha, which are the chariots. And these two pieces are functionally the same as the knight and rook in Western chess, so hopefully no problems there. The final difference is that Padati, or pawns in Chaturanga, are much more simpler in nature than they are in chess. They still capture diagonally forward, but can only move one square from the start, so no double moves. Taken together, the games of Chaturanga that I've experienced are somewhat slower, and dominant strategies seem to revolve around advancing the A and H pawns to free up the all-important chariots, which are much more powerful given that kings are not allowed to castle, and the fact that the Gaja and the Mantri are much more limited in their movement and attacking potential compared to their equivalents in Western chess. Where things get really interesting though is when you start to use chaturanga as a baseline to compare two different cultural manifestations of the same game. So as a kid, I assumed that chess was a Western game invented by Europeans. I mean, it has kings, knights, bishops, rooks, queens, all hallmarks of medieval Western European culture. And it makes sense that once they got their hands on the Indian game and brought it back home, they changed the pieces, rules, theories to reflect their local geography. Hence, you get the London system, Scotch game, Scandinavian defense, Sicilian defense, and there are some homages to the origins, as in the King's Indian defense, for example, but otherwise you'd be pretty hard-pressed to look at a contemporary game of chess and identify its ethnic origins. Xiangqi, on the other hand, literally means elephant game, and you can very directly trace its lineage back to chaturanga in its name alone. Cantonese has the exact same translation, although it's pronounced Xiangqi, which I would prefer to use, but the Mandarin is much more commonly used in English language representations, so for the sake of not confusing the heck out of everyone, I will begrudgingly acquiesce to the tyranny of the majority in this case. Language issues aside, the fascinating thing about Xiangqi is that it's an incredibly popular game that has at least the same number of players as Western chess worldwide, although most of its player base lives in East Asia. Xiangqi's history dates back to the spread of Buddhist cultural influences and material trade along the Silk Road, which are attributed as major factors allowing chess to pollinate from India into Chinese culture and develop at the same intensity as chess did in Western Europe. But history aside, let's talk about the game. So the board in Xiangqi is a rectangle. It's a 9x10 rectangle with 9 vertical files and 10 horizontal ranks. The pieces are played at the vertices of lines, which aligns with how pieces are played in the other major Chinese board game, Go. There's also a river in the middle of the field with the Chinese text Chu River and Han border, which is traditionally written in the space, and this is mostly flavor text and refers to the Chu-Han conflict in ancient China, which is presumably where this game originated. There is also a 2x2 box in the back of each player's side of the board with diagonal lines known as the palace. And we'll get into that once we talk about the pieces, but by and large, that's the board sorted. Alright, so first we've got our general, and there are one per side, and they sit at the back of the palace in the center. Generals are unique in that they don't have the same range of movement as a king or raja in chess or chaturanga respectively. They can only move horizontally or vertically as demonstrated in the moves that I'm just placing on the board here, but they live within the palace so they cannot leave it. And in order to provide them with a little bit more defense, we add 2 advisors per side flanking the general, and these units are also restricted to the palace, but they can use the diagonal lines, and in fact they are only allowed to move diagonally across these lines and only within the palace boundaries. So taken together, both of them provide at least another level of defense so that your king, who would otherwise be pretty exposed, has some extra level of defense here. But next we move beyond the palace and we grab the pieces, which are the namesake of the game, are elephants. And the elephants move the same way that elephants do in chaturanga. However, they do not jump, so they can be restricted in their movement, and they are also limited to their side of the field. So they cannot cross the river, making them entirely defensive pieces. Here's just an example of if a piece is happening to block its way. It cannot jump the same way that an elephant in chaturanga could jump, and therefore it's important to keep in mind that its positioning in relation to other pieces is important. The same is true for horses, which follow the same movement pattern as horses in chaturanga and knights in chess. However, it's important to keep in mind that they do not jump as well, so they follow the same rule as the elephant. And here's just a range of motion that's available to them in an entirely open field, so it's the same as chess. But the interesting thing is when you start to add intermediary pieces, and it's important to recognize that that horses move 1 point orthogonally, so right, left, up, down, followed by 1 point diagonally. So in this case, you can see what happens when you add 1 piece to block the horse, and it can have drastic impacts, and I definitely found that to be a pretty big learning curve and something to adjust coming from Western chess. Finally, we've got our chariots rounding out the back rows, and these are functionally the same as rooks in Western chess and chariots in chaturanga. So long as they have the ability to and the freedom of space, they can move along the lines as far as you please. Finally, there wouldn't be a unique aspect to Xiangqi if it wasn't for the inclusion of the most Chinese of inventions, gunpowder. That's right, we've got cannons in the game, and the way that cannons work are that they can move the same way that rooks do in chess and the same way that chariots do. However, their attacking pattern is different in that they jump and they use a mount, which is another intermediary piece, to capture another piece across the board, which is where they land and they must move from. So in this case, you can see how you might use your own piece as well as an opponent's piece as a mount to capture another an opposing piece. So it adds an extra layer of strategy, of positioning, of looking at the board and trying to figure out where you're vulnerable and where you might have opportunities. That's really unique to the game that you don't see in any other iteration. Finally, you've got your 5 soldiers per side. And these work the same way that pawns do. However, there are fewer of them, so it's harder to make a pawn chain. But once they cross the river, they also gain an additional move set, so they can move horizontally once they cross the river, which is something that they cannot do when they're on their side. And this provides them with a little bit more of an advantage when they're across the river, meaning that points-wise, they are worth more when they're across the river as opposed to when they're on their own side. So as someone trying to learn Chinese, I do appreciate the fact that my own set and the default on xiangqi.com uses the Chinese traditional characters on the pieces, but if you happen to want to look at the more iconic representations of them, there's actually the option to change that. So we'll keep that on for the remainder of this part of the video, but just as a heads up, that is where you can change the setting. I wanted to leave you with a quick example of a game that I played between myself and an opponent online. And I think it's an interesting game, not because of its strategic merit, far from it. I think if anything, it just demonstrates how some of the concepts that we talked about earlier on manifest in practice. So it can be one thing entirely to understand how the pieces work independently of one another, but it's another thing entirely when you start to look at them as working in concert with one another to really generate attacks, to defend against your opponent's pieces, and to really put up a fight in the game, because I think that's where some of the fun comes in, rather than just randomly throwing pieces around, especially when you don't understand what they do or how they interact with each other. So my opponent started out with the central cannon opening, which is where you place your cannon right in front of your general, and this is just at the front of your palace. There's quite a few reasons why this move is powerful and recommended for beginners, and the primary one is that it opens up opportunities of attack on your general. So the interesting thing about the cannon jumping over pieces is that if you happen to move your pieces in the central file in specific ways, you might inadvertently find yourself in a position where you open yourself up to discovered attacks, to skewers, to pins, all of which are present in Western chess, and this is terminology that you can pretty easily apply to Xiangqi, and they have the exact same principles. So it's rooted in the same theories, and once you get to that point where you recognize that it's a matter of just understanding the unique movement of the pieces and how they generate similar principles that you might find in Western chess, I think that was sort of the point where I started to really appreciate the nature of Xiangqi as a variation of chaturanga rather than some sort of mystery variant of a game that had no root in something that I could really feasibly see myself understanding or picking up with any degree of certainty or any degree of expertise. So I'm having fun with it so far, and I'm trying to get my opponent in a what's called the flying general checkmate, which is where you prevent your opponent's general from moving into the line of sight of your general, and that's considered a checkmate. But unfortunately, my opponent has other plans for me, and that involves a back rank checkmate that's placed expertly by their chariot here. So no win for me, but quite a fun game nonetheless, and I hope you found that interesting. Next here, we've got my family's heirloom Mahjong set sitting in front of me in this case. As you can tell by its appearance, it's quite well worn, well loved by the family, and I feel like every Chinese household in Calgary has a Mahjong set and similar table tucked away in a side closet or in a basement. ready for those family gatherings where you're looking to swindle your family members out of every last dime in their pocket. This is my disclaimer that there can be elements of gambling involved with Mahjong, and to exercise responsible gaming when you play. But for the most part, most of the gambling sort of connotations of the game faded away with the sort of mystique that it used to exist in the Chinatowns of generations past, when there were a lot more grist for the rumor mill. Diatribe aside though, this game is known as Mahjong, or in Cantonese as Mahjong, which translates to mean sparrows. Not too sure about how this name came to be or its significance, but the most popular theory that I've seen is that the sound of washing tiles seems to resemble that of sparrows. Not too sure, we get a lot of magpies and seagulls here in Calgary, but if you happen to know the sound of sparrows, you'll be more informed about whether or not this comparison is apt. As far as the interior is concerned, you'll see your tiles here. There are 144 of them total, and we'll go through them just so you can understand what they look like and how they are played in the game. We're going to take all this side compartment out. It's filled up with a few other bits and bobs that won't really be covered in this overview. So on the table in front of me, I have all 144 tiles in a classic Mahjong set laid out, and it's a little bit overwhelming like this. So let's start by dividing them into their categories, and then we can start to explain how the game works based on a more categorical understanding of how these pieces work together. Alright, so now that we have all of the tiles laid out in front of us here, hopefully it starts to make a little bit more sense how they might be related to one another and some of the similarities and differences between these tiles, because ultimately the game is very much about recognizing what you might be able to pull from the central pile and what your opponents might be trying to collect in their hands. So when it comes to the majority of the pieces, that'll be constituting the left three columns, as you can tell by the fact that these are all somewhat uniform, and you can kind of consider them the three major suits of the deck of Mahjong, if you want to put it that way. The leftmost one is consisting of all circles, so pretty self-explanatory, 1 at the top, 9 at the bottom. The same is true for the sticks in the middle column here. And the only difference here, and the thing to keep in mind, is that for the one stick character, you're looking at the bird depiction here, and that's typical for most Mahjong sets. So it's something to keep in mind because it might not be entirely intuitive when you first start playing. Finally, in the third column, we've got our Chinese characters, and these are the only set of characters where you actually need to understand what they translate into, and it's essentially just the same as 1 to 9. And if you happen to come across a westernized set of Mahjong, they will typically have Romanized numerals on there as well, so usually it's not something to concern yourself with, but if you happen to need it, then having a cheat sheet on your side will only require the translation from 1 to 9 in Chinese. So next we have our honors tiles, of which there are 28 total. We start with our cardinal directions, and these are referred to as the winds. We start with east on the top, followed by south, west, and north, and these are just printed onto the tiles in blue. And then next in the honors set, we have our 3 sets of 4 dragon tiles, and these are represented by red, green, and white. Finally, we have our bonus tiles, of which there are 8 total. So we've got 4 flowers, and these are represented by plum blossom, orchid, chrysanthemum, and bamboo, as well as 4 seasons tiles, and these are spring, summer, autumn, and winter. We won't cover these tiles in detail too much, but they do play into how hands are dealt out and where you grab tiles when the game actually starts. So it's useful to take note of them, but don't get too worried. The major ones that you want to be concerned with are your suited tiles and your honors tiles for just picking up the game and playing. Alright, so we're gonna take a moment here and just play through a couple of games just to demonstrate how the game actually works, so that you have an idea of the basic rules as well as how to actually win a game of Mahjong. So to start out with, everyone begins their game with the exact same hand size, except for the first player who draws an extra tile from the wall. Once you do that, you pass a tile into the center, and then you're down to 13 tiles, which is the same as everyone else, and the game starts. So a winning hand consists of 14 tiles, which is what you're trying to get to. And the way that you create a winning hand is by creating 4 sets of 3 plus a pair. And that's the most basic setup. There's obviously some exceptions to this rule, but fundamentally, that's what the majority of your winning hands are going to look like as you first
Ciao.
start playing the game. And how you create these winning hands can come up to a multitude of combinations, which is sort of the beauty of it, is recognizing what you have in your hand, what might be in the central piles, and what your opponents are discarding. But we can sort of demonstrate that in practice based on the chow that I just took advantage of. And the opponent to my left here, MickeyBot, dropped the 2-stick, which allowed me to complete a straight. And that's the first major meld that you want to keep in mind is your chow. We have the opportunity to do so here as well, but I don't really want it. I already have a 6, 7, and 8, so I don't really see the point in having a 5. There's no value to having a 4 straight, so there's no value to having a 5, 6, 7, 8, 6, 7, 8, 9. It doesn't do anything, and more than anything, it just gluts up your hand with a useless tile, unless you can turn that into 2 sets of 3. If you have like a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, those would count as 2 separate melds. So each meld counts for 3 tiles, no more, no less. And we have a chow here. Let's see if we can get a triplet here just to demonstrate the other type. But the other thing about a chow to keep in mind is that the chows can only be grabbed from the player preceding you. So I can only grab them from Mickey. I cannot grab them from Jerry or Tom in this instance, just because of the particularities of it. Oh, amazing. So Jerry was able to achieve a pung here, which is the other major meld that you'll run into. And there we go, another one. But pungs are unique in that you can grab them from anyone who discards them. So whereas your chows have to be played in the same order, so you can only grab them from the preceding player, for pung, if you're trying to complete a identical triplet, which is 3 of the exact same type, then you can grab them from anyone who discards them from their hand into the center. So there's a certain strategy that comes along with that. You can either skip over your opponent's turns, or conversely, you might get skipped over depending on if someone else grabs a tile and they happen to be in the order that immediately follows you in the order sequence. So something to keep in mind, and those are the major quality differences between a pung and a chow. So those are the 2 major melds that you're going to be looking for throughout the game. And the other thing to consider as well is that if you pull a triplet from the wall and your opponents don't see, you're not obligated to show it. Whereas if you complete either a pung or a chow, I'm going to grab this 4 here because it completes my 4.
Pung.
But when you do grab from the middle, you do have to demonstrate or prove that it completes a set. You're not just grabbing it for willy-nilly or out of fun. So when it does complete a set, you need to demonstrate that it completes that set to everyone. And there's strategic advantages to holding things in your hand as opposed to trying to grab something from the wall, depending on the probability that it might show up naturally. More often than not, though, it's a better idea to grab where you can to complete your sets, and hopefully you can do it a little bit faster than your opponents are able to complete their sets. So ultimately, you're just collecting tiles and passing away tiles in a sequential fashion so that you can end up with 4 sets of 3 followed by your eyes. And in this case, I have my straight with the 6, 7, 8 sticks. I have a 7, 8, 9 with the characters. So really I'm just looking for a west tile, which can be a little bit tricky to find, and I might be sitting here for a while looking for it. So we'll see if I get fortunate enough in the natural course of events. But it does come down to looking at what the opponents are playing as well and seeing if we can't take advantage of that and what we think might be a little bit more likely to be available. There's also the element of when you're looking for tiles, the other players might be looking for the exact same tiles, and this is especially true when it comes to triplets, because you might have 2 and then an opponent might have 2, and if there's only 4 in the deck, you don't know that the other person has the 2 that you're looking for, and both of you are just looking for 1 additional tile to complete your set. So you can get into some pretty frustrating mind games with other players and just trying to find the 1 missing tile. But we're fortunate enough to grab the west tile here,
Mahjong.
And we have completed the win. So we're gonna dive right into a second game. That was a little bit easier. We just grabbed as many pairs, as many melds as we could without any sense of how they might work together. So let's try this round to be a little bit more intentional about it. There are versions of the game where you can kind of just pick it up and whatever sets you happen to come across are valid and legal. But there are also sets to make it a little bit more complex, so you're not just grabbing straights and triplets and whatnot willy-nilly, but there's actual values to the hands that you are able to accumulate over time, so there's a little bit more strategic planning there. So for the sake of this example, I'm just going to try to do triplets the entire way through. You're starting out with the bird sticks, and they have a little stork on these ones, which is a nice aesthetic touch. But yeah, by grabbing similar sets, it makes it a little bit easier to, or I guess it makes it harder, the opposite of what I just said. It makes it a little bit harder to get a winning hand, but at the same time, the stakes are a little bit higher, and it makes for somewhat more interesting games when you're not just pulling whatever you find, but you're strategically trying to coordinate your pieces so that they follow some sort of sequence. And my family has a sheet of paper that has the varying I guess, qualities of the hands you can build, and then the corresponding points that you get from achieving these types of hands. And they vary depending on whether or not you have just straights, just triplets, if you have quadruplets in there, if you have triplets of your honors tiles, depending on the type. And then flowers come into play depending on the direction of the game and the length of the game. So depending on how many rounds you're playing and what round it is. Depending on what flowers, tiles, and seasonal tiles you pull, those might be worth additional points. So that's why they are there. But honestly, those are all pieces of information that you'll pick up over the natural course of just playing the game over time. It's not really something you need when you first start out, as long as you're having fun and just like building triplets, quadruplets, and straights. That's truthfully all you need to know. And it's an incredibly simple game with I guess a high skill ceiling. Maybe that's the best way to put it, is that it's easy to pick up but hard to master, and that's why there's so many dedicated communities out there. I'm certainly taking my time with these hands, and in my own family, I'd get a lot of pushback for taking more than just a couple of seconds to recognize what was played down and whether or not I need it. They certainly wouldn't give me this much leeway of clicking a button or give me the opportunity to. A lot of the time when you're playing the game, you kind of just either adapt to what's on the board immediately before the next player goes, or you forfeit that opportunity, whatever it happens to be. We're getting pretty close here. I've got a red dragon and an east tile here to potentially complete my eye set. Although if I happen to get another red dragon in through the natural course of pulling tiles from the center, I might be able to use that. But oh, and I do. Amazing. So the same thing applies to the east tile, but I decided to get rid of it there. There's always risks at the end. Yeah, and there we go. Jerry here grabs the east tile. Because they tend to be a little bit more valuable near the end of the game, you kind of want to be either throwing out these honor tiles earlier on, in my experience at the very least, rather than waiting till the end and potentially giving away the winning piece that someone was waiting for, either to complete a triplet or to complete their eyes.
Mahjong.
There we go. So we've secured the win here, and oh, there's actually an indication here that because you have a pung hand, it leads to additional points. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense and gives you a bit of an overview on how the game of Mahjong actually works in practice.